Alright everyone, it's time for the Occult video number 260, the coming internet cult moral panic. This is a prediction that I'm making to get out ahead of the bus because, that typically is a good idea. That the next thing, or at least one of the soon-to-be next things, that all of these Chardonnay tear criers will whine about, the soccer mom PTA sorts that typically generate moral panics because they lash out at the world because their life is boring and it's too decadent and it's too safe. They look for things to bitch about, essentially. I think that internet cult activity will be one of the next things. And it follows a pattern. Like, it's sort of a repetition of the early 80s, sort of early wave of things that happened. Like, crime shows are big right now. Like, people watching stuff like true crime documentation. It's one small step from them watching the dramatized accounts there to trying to find a real-world example of some sort of activity for them to complain about. Now, as I've said before, moral panics always carry a kernel of truth. For instance, during the Satanic Panic, it is true, there were Satanists at the time. There were troubled teenagers cutting off cats' heads at the time. And occasionally there were ritualistic cults that did butcher people. They were extremely rare. The problem is that there was no common sense voice to proclaim this because the moralists would always say, well, if you're arguing against us, maybe you're a witch. Essentially, it's sort of like the witch hunt sort of thing over again. What'll end up happening is that the moralists will try to say, well, the internet's overrun by cults that are trying to indoctrinate people. Now, they've already done this with alt-right. They've already done this with political extremism, and it's by and large not true. The kernel of truth is that there are always a few fanatics out there. There are always a few cults out there, some of which are engaged in shitty behavior. By and large, though, they'll always identify the wrong party because the other part is that the moral panic always involves attempts, usually by moneyed groups, through the soccer moms, to lash out at competitors, to lash out at something like that. So what we've seen in the internet with every moral panic we've already been through, the libertarian to alt-right mythology, political fanaticism in general, and so forth, in every single instance, the initial kernel of truth, that is, some small problem that exists on the internet, well, regardless of what kind of fanatic or weirdo it happens to encompass, is then used by billionaires to try to crack down on free speech, to try to crack down on the competitors of Hollywood, or the lamestream media, or the legacy media as I call it, or mainstream publishers of music, or whatever it happens to be. They use the moral panic to try to make themselves look good, and to try to suppress competitors, because that's opportunism, that's the way it works. What happens is that a moral panic tends to dry up after a while because the people begin cannibalizing their own movement leaders, and then the movement leaders step back and allow the movement to implode in order to defend themselves because they don't want to be attrition. They don't want to be destroyed, stabbed by their own sword, so to speak. They don't want to be destroyed by the lynch mob they themselves have generated. What'll happen is that at some point, some soccer moms will get together and start rambling about online cults, and they'll form a little movement, and this movement will get co-opted by a bunch of corporations, which will pump millions into it, brand it, round the corners, and make it shiny and palatable to a family audience, and they'll tell lurid tales about it, and then they'll get a lot of money back out of it, because what'll end up happening is that inevitably the competitors of these same groups, or sort of phenomena, genres of creation on different websites or whatever, will be the target. Oh, they're the ones that are causing this witchery. We've seen this. We saw this with the alt-right stuff. Well, there never was a libertarian to alt-right pipeline. By the way, people have totally forgotten about it now, haven't they? Not that many years on, nobody gives a fucking shit about that phenomenon anymore. Of course, the thing was dismantled when it became clear it was untenable because it was clearly untrue. Independent content creators largely fought back successfully against that. But it still fulfilled its goal, which was to introduce a lot of new censorship onto the internet. The groups that pushed it were never actually concerned about an army of Nazis. They were concerned that they wanted to be able to censor people because they were losing money. So activist firms with parent companies and organized leaders like George Soros, who also have their hands in the mass media, corporate entertainment industry, surprisingly, the people that they identified as problematic were competing with the same groups they were partnered with. It's amazing how that happens. The same thing will happen the next time as well. So this is just a little bit of an occult prediction for you. I'm trying to be Nostradamus at the moment, only more accurate because mostly he just talked in very vague terms. I see this moral panic eventually coming. When it does, anyone who tries to defend the persecuted, the witches of that particular era, will in turn be attacked. This happened with the alt-right thing years ago. I'm a libertarian. I tried to defend people who are alt-right and their ability to speak, and of course, even to this day, people on the left still think that I'm an alt-righter and a fascist and call me a white supremacist because of the fact that I had a conversation with Richard Spencer. So keep that in mind as well. If you decide to actually raise a battle cry against censorship and suppression, the Chardonnay tier swindlers, the morons of society, the dregs, the bored housewives, the little school marm sort of people, the hall monitors of society, the worthless people, the suburbanite core will be the ones that will attack you. And they'll never even realize most of the time that they're working for corporations. The activists that partner with them will. The ones that give them money, the ones that help them actually lash out in large numbers in an organized capacity, they'll know what they're doing because they're working for, some corporatist somewhere, some bank. They won't know, though. They'll think that they're fighting cults, just like they thought they were fighting Nazis a few years ago. Interesting how it devolved into them attempting to punch people out in order to prevent political violence. This is the sort of thing that doesn't make sense in retrospect to anyone, including those that partook in the movement, so-called, the corporate-sponsored pro-censorship movement. But at the time, a lot of them believe it. It's the same goddamn tired story over and over again. I'm just proclaiming that I think that the next big one will probably involve online cult activity. The internet is definitely the conduit of communication at this point. It is the place for all entertainment. It's the place for everything. Insofar as that's true, additional moral panics will almost inevitably tend to be internet related. It's interesting how the actual problems that are more widespread, like, the Catholic clergy being a bunch of pederasts, those things get ignored. They get covered up over time and people stop talking about them. But there are still people that bitch and whine about the non-existent libertarian to alt-right pipeline. And there always will be because it's like they get going and some of them just can't get rid of it. Because it's like their glory days and they always want them to be around. They're like, no, don't lose interest. Why is my Facebook group Kill Nazis shrinking all of a sudden? Oh my God, it must be evidence of more Nazis. And they sort of work themselves up and it's always very funny to see them run themselves in circles. That's about all. Peace out.